She was only 7 years old when a flight attendant placed a paper labeled "monkey" on her seat. But what that woman didn't know would destroy her life forever. This is the story of Chichi Asala, a little girl whose quiet dignity brought a racist to her knees and exposed the ugliest kind of hatred hiding behind a professional smile. What happened on Flight SA-447 would make headlines around the world, send someone to prison, and prove that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most power. But before we get to that moment that changed everything, you need to understand how it all began. It was a bright Tuesday morning at Murtala Muhammad International Airport in Lagos, Nigeria. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch flights, families saying tearful goodbyes, and business people barking into their phones. But in the middle of all that noise and movement, there was a little girl who stood out, not because she was loud or demanding attention, but because of the pure joy radiating from her bright, eager eyes. Her name was Chichi Asala. She was 7 years old, with rich dark skin that seemed to glow in the airport's fluorescent lighting, and her natural hair was styled into 2 perfect puffs on either side of her head, each one carefully shaped by her mother's loving hands that very morning. She wore a simple yellow sundress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem, white sandals that were just a little scuffed from play, and around her neck hung a lanyard with a badge that read, "Unaccompanied Minor." In her small arms she clutched a stuffed giraffe that had seen better days. Its name was Spotty, and if you asked Chichi she'd tell you with absolute certainty that Spotty was her best friend in the whole world. Chichi wasn't crying or clinging to her parents like some children do when facing their first solo flight. Instead, she was humming a song her grandmother used to sing to her, something soft and melodic that made her feel brave. She was excited, genuinely thrilled about this adventure. She was going to London to spend 2 whole weeks with her grandmother, the woman who told the best stories, made the sweetest chin-chin, and always smelled like cocoa butter and love. The thought made Chichi bounce slightly on her toes as she waited to board. What made Chichi special wasn't just her sweet disposition or her obvious intelligence. It was the way she carried herself with a natural politeness that seemed beyond her years. When the announcement came for her flight, SA-447 to London Heathrow, she thanked the gate agent who checked her boarding pass. She said, "Excuse me," when she needed to get past someone. She was the kind of child that made adults smile and think, "That's a well-raised little girl." And she was. Her parents had taught her to be kind, to be respectful, to speak clearly and look people in the eye. They taught her that she was just as worthy of respect as anyone else, that her brown skin was beautiful, that her voice mattered. But there was something else about Chichi Asala, something that wasn't obvious from looking at her simple yellow dress or her worn stuffed giraffe. Something that the people who would soon judge her couldn't possibly know. We'll get to that later because right now, Chichi was just a 7-year-old girl excited to see her grandmother, completely unaware that in less than an hour, someone would try to make her feel like she didn't belong. Now let's talk about Phoebe. Phoebe was the lead flight attendant on SA-447 that morning, and if you asked anyone at Skyways International Airlines, they'd tell you she was a model employee. She'd been with the company for 12 years, had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time, and had received multiple commendations for her service. On paper she was perfect. In person she was tall and blonde, with hair pulled back into such a severe bun that it seemed to stretch her already sharp features even tighter. Her uniform was immaculate, not a thread out of place, her makeup applied with precision, her smile practiced and professional. Phoebe had grown up in a small town where everyone looked like her, thought like her, and she'd always felt that gave her a certain position in the world. She joined the airline industry because she liked the uniform, the authority, the way passengers looked at her with a mixture of need and respect. She liked being in control of her cabin, liked deciding who got extra attention and who got the bare minimum. And over the years, a pattern had developed, one that was subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but clear enough if you paid attention. Watch Phoebe work the cabin before takeoff and you'd see it. When she approached the white passengers in first class and business class, her smile brightened, her voice softened, she'd lean in conspiratorially and offer extra pillows before they even asked. "Can I get you anything else? A newspaper? Another glass of champagne?" She'd coo, treating them like honored guests. But when she moved past passengers who didn't fit her narrow definition of who belonged in the premium cabin, particularly black and brown passengers, her demeanor shifted. The smile became tight and perfunctory. The offers dried up. Her eyes would do a quick, judgmental scan, and you could almost hear the question forming in her mind, "How did you afford this seat?" She'd never been officially reprimanded, not really. Oh, there had been complaints over the years, 3 to be exact. One from a Nigerian businessman who said she'd questioned his boarding pass 3 times. Another from an Indian family who said she'd ignored their service requests while attending to others. A third from a black woman who said Phoebe had asked if she was sure she was in the right section. But each time, Phoebe had smiled sweetly at her supervisors, explained that it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just being thorough, just doing her job. And each time, the complaints had been filed away and forgotten. After all, Phoebe had been there for 12 years. She knew how to play the game. Working alongside Phoebe that day was Mimi, a younger flight attendant who'd only been with Skyways for 8 months. Mimi was small and soft-spoken, with nervous hands that were always smoothing her uniform or tucking imaginary stray hairs behind her ears. She'd taken this job because she needed it, because the pay was decent and her family needed help with bills. She'd learned quickly that the easiest way to survive was to follow Phoebe's lead, to laugh at her jokes, to mirror her behavior. Mimi had seen the way Phoebe treated certain passengers. It made her uncomfortable, made her stomach twist sometimes, but she never said anything. She couldn't afford to make waves. So she became complicit through her silence, a shadow to Phoebe's cruelty. The boarding process began, and business-class passengers started filing onto the plane. Phoebe stood at the entrance with her practiced smile, greeting each one. "Welcome aboard. Welcome to Skyways International. Your seat is just up ahead." She was charm itself, professionally warm, the perfect advertisement for the airline. Then came Chichi. The ground staff member who escorted her was named John, a kind-faced man in his 50s who'd been working at the airport for 20 years. He held Chichi's hand gently as they walked down the jet bridge, and she chattered happily to him about her grandmother, about the stories she hoped to hear, about whether there would be snow in London. John smiled and told her he wasn't sure about snow in the summer, but maybe she'd see some rain. When they reached the aircraft door, he bent down to Chichi's level and pointed toward the front of the plane. "Your seat is right up there, sweetheart. 3A. That's a window seat so you'll be able to see the clouds. Pretty exciting, right?" Chichi nodded enthusiastically, hugging Spotty tighter. John continued, "Now if you need anything at all, you just press that button above your seat and one of these nice flight attendants will help you." "Okay." Chichi nodded again, suddenly feeling a little nervous now that John was leaving. He must have sensed it because he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You're going to do great. You're a brave girl. Have a wonderful flight." Phoebe had watched this entire exchange from her position near the galley, and something dark flickered across her face. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she took in the scene. This little black girl with her puffed hair and her simple dress, being escorted to a business-class seat. Business class. Seat 3A, one of the most expensive seats on the plane. Her mind immediately began calculating, judging, questioning. She watched Chichi make her way down the aisle, watched her climb into the large leather seat that seemed to swallow her small frame, watched her carefully place Spotty in the seat beside her before remembering she couldn't do that and moving him to her lap instead. After John left, Phoebe composed her face into what she thought was a welcoming expression and approached Chichi's row. But if you'd been paying attention, if you'd really looked, you'd have seen that this smile was different from the one she'd given the other passengers. This smile didn't reach her eyes. This smile was edged with something cold. "Well, hello there," Phoebe said, her voice dripping with a condescension that she probably thought sounded kind. "Getting all settled in, are we?" Chichi looked up at her and smiled, that open, trusting smile that children give to adults they expect will be kind. "Yes, ma'am. I'm going to see my grandmother in London." Phoebe's eyes did a quick, dismissive scan of Chichi's outfit, of Spotty, of everything about this child that didn't fit Phoebe's narrow idea of who belonged in this cabin. "How nice," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. She glanced at the seat number, then at her passenger manifest, then back at Chichi, making a show of checking and double-checking. "And you're in 3A? By yourself?" "Yes, ma'am. My badge says I'm an unaccompanied minor. That means I'm traveling alone, but people are supposed to help me if I need it." Chichi said this matter-of-factly, repeating what her parents had explained to her. Phoebe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The child was well-spoken, clearly intelligent, but that didn't change the question burning in Phoebe's mind. How did this child afford business class? Around them, other passengers were settling in. In seat 2A, directly in front of Chichi, sat Cindy, a middle-aged white woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. She was traveling for work, some consulting project in London, and she was tired before the flight even began. She'd noticed the little girl being escorted on, had thought she was adorable, and now she was aware of the flight attendant's odd behavior. Something about the way this Phoebe woman was hovering over the child seemed off. In seat 4C, across the aisle and one row back, sat Mark, A businessman in an expensive suit with his laptop already open, spreadsheets glowing on the screen. He had earbuds in and was deeply absorbed in his work, barely aware of anything happening around him. He was the kind of passenger flight attendants loved because he never asked for anything and never complained. Phoebe straightened up, still wearing that tight smile. "Let me get you something to drink, sweetheart. We have juice, water, soda. What would you like?" The offer seemed nice enough on the surface, but the way she said, "sweetheart," made it sound like an insult. Chichi, innocent to the undercurrents of adult cruelty, simply said, "Orange juice please, ma'am." Phoebe walked away and Chichi settled back into her seat, looking out the window at the workers loading luggage below. She was so excited she could barely sit still. She didn't notice Phoebe in the galley, pouring orange juice with more force than necessary, her mouth pressed into a hard line. She didn't notice the way Phoebe whispered something to Mimi that made the younger woman's eyes go wide. She didn't notice the way Phoebe glanced back at her with something that looked an awful lot like contempt. When Phoebe returned with the juice, she placed it on Chichi's tray table with a deliberate lack of care, the cup making a hard sound against the plastic. "There you go," she said. Then, as if she couldn't help herself, as if the question had been burning inside her and she just had to let it out, she added, "You know, sweetheart, sometimes there are mix-ups with seating assignments. Are you absolutely sure you're supposed to be in this seat? In business class?" The question hung in the air like poison. Chichi looked confused, her small forehead wrinkling. "Yes, ma'am. My daddy booked it for me. It says 3A on my boarding pass." She held up the pass helpfully, trying to show Phoebe that there was no mistake. But Phoebe barely glanced at it. She hummed, a sound of obvious disbelief. "Well, just wanted to make sure. We'll see." She walked away again, leaving Chichi feeling strange and uncertain in a way she couldn't quite name. The little girl took a sip of her orange juice and hugged Spotty a little tighter. Something didn't feel right, but she didn't know what. She was 7 years old, and while her parents had begun to teach her about the world, about how some people might treat her differently because of her skin, she'd never experienced it herself. Not really. Not like this. If you're watching this and you're already feeling angry, if you're already thinking about what you'd do in this situation, hit that subscribe button right now. This story is just getting started, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Chichi sat in her seat, unaware that in less than an hour, everything would change. Unaware that the woman who just questioned her belonging was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Unaware that she, a 7-year-old girl with a stuffed giraffe and a yellow sundress, was about to teach the world a lesson about dignity, justice, and the price of hatred. The other passengers continued boarding. The overhead bins filled with luggage. The plane prepared for departure. And Phoebe, standing near the galley with her arms crossed, stared at Chichi with a look that promised this was far from over. What would you do if you saw a child being treated this way? Would you speak up or would you stay silent? Let me know in the comments, because what happens next is going to test everyone on that plane. The cabin had settled into that familiar pre-flight rhythm. Passengers were stowing their bags, adjusting their seats, pulling out books and tablets, settling in for the 6-hour journey ahead. The air conditioning hummed softly, mixing with the murmur of quiet conversations and the occasional ding of call buttons. Everything seemed normal, routine, just another flight from Lagos to London. But for Chichi Asala, sitting in seat 3A with Spotty clutched in her lap, something felt increasingly wrong. She couldn't name it yet, couldn't put words to the feeling crawling up her spine, but it was there, settling heavy in her small chest. Phoebe hadn't left her alone. Not really. Even as she attended to other passengers, even as she moved through the cabin with her practiced efficiency, her eyes kept drifting back to Chichi. It was like she couldn't help herself, like the sight of this little black girl in a business class seat was a thorn in her side that she couldn't stop poking at. And now, as the final passengers boarded and the crew prepared for departure, Phoebe decided it was time to make her suspicions known to everyone. She approached Chichi's seat again, this time with her passenger manifest in hand, her finger trailing down the list as if she were having trouble finding something. She stopped at Chichi's row and made a deliberate show of checking the seat number against her papers, her eyes moving from the overhead bin to the seat marker to Chichi herself, over and over again. "Excuse me, sweetie," she said, her voice loud enough that several nearby passengers glanced over. "I need to see your boarding pass again." Chichi, confused but still polite, still trusting that adults knew what they were doing and had good reasons for their requests, pulled the boarding pass from the seat pocket in front of her. Her small hands trembled slightly as she held it out. "Here you go, ma'am." Phoebe took it, studied it with exaggerated scrutiny, turned it over as if she might find something suspicious on the back, then held it up to the light as though checking for forgery. The performance was obvious, insulting, and intentional. Phoebe said, a sound heavy with implication. She looked at Chichi, then at the boarding pass, then back at Chichi, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Then, in a voice that carried through the cabin, she called out, "Mimi? Could you come here for a moment?" The younger flight attendant appeared quickly, nervousness written all over her face. She knew that tone in Phoebe's voice, knew it meant trouble for someone. "Yes, Phoebe?" Phoebe leaned in close to Mimi, but her whisper was one of those theatrical whispers that isn't meant to be private at all. It was designed to be heard, to plant seeds of doubt in everyone's minds. "Double-check this for me, will you? Something seems off. The booking, the seat assignment. I just want to make sure everything is in order." She handed Mimi the boarding pass, and the younger woman took it with shaking hands, her eyes darting between Phoebe and Chichi uncertainly. Chichi's stomach dropped. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand what could possibly be wrong with her boarding pass, that it needed to be checked 3 times now, but she knew it wasn't normal. She'd never been on a plane by herself before, but her parents flew often and she'd been with them many times. She'd never seen them have their boarding passes examined like this, never seen flight attendants whisper about them, never felt this kind of attention. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Her parents had taught her to speak up, to ask questions, to advocate for herself. Even at 7 she knew she had that right. Phoebe's smile was poisonous. "Just doing my job, dear. Sometimes mistakes happen with special bookings." The way she said "special bookings" made it sound like something suspicious, something that didn't quite belong. Mimi examined the boarding pass, found nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong, and handed it back to Phoebe with a helpless shrug. "It looks fine to me. Everything matches." Phoebe's jaw tightened. She'd been hoping for backup, for validation of her suspicions, but Mimi had failed to provide it. "Fine," she said curtly, handing the boarding pass back to Chichi with barely concealed irritation. "Keep it handy. We might need to check it again." In seat 2A, Cindy had been watching this entire exchange, and her frown deepened with each passing moment. She'd been a consultant for 20 years, had worked in dozens of countries, had seen every kind of human behavior in airports and on planes. And she knew what she was witnessing right now. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't a flight attendant being thorough or careful. This was harassment, plain and simple, and it was directed at a child. A 7-year-old child. Cindy's hands clenched into fists on her armrests, but she didn't say anything. Not yet. She wanted to see where this was going, wanted to be sure before she intervened. But she was paying attention now, sharp and focused, ready to act if needed. Phoebe walked away from Chichi's seat, but only to the galley, where she grabbed a clipboard and began making notations with aggressive pen strokes. Mimi hovered nearby, uncomfortable and uncertain. "Phoebe, the boarding pass was valid. Everything checked out," she said quietly, hoping to calm whatever storm was brewing in her senior colleague. Phoebe shot her a look that could have frozen water. "I know what I saw. Just stay alert." What had she seen? A little black girl in a yellow dress who didn't fit Phoebe's narrow, bigoted view of who deserved to sit in business class. That was all. That was the crime. She returned to Chichi's seat yet again, this time with the clipboard held prominently in front of her like a shield or a weapon. She stood there, making a show of checking boxes, writing notes, comparing information, all while staring at Chichi with undisguised suspicion. The little girl squirmed under the scrutiny, her earlier excitement about the flight evaporating into anxiety and confusion. She hugged Spotty tighter against her chest, the stuffed giraffe's worn fabric suddenly the only comfort in a situation that was becoming increasingly frightening. Other passengers were starting to notice now. Mark, the businessman in 4C, glanced up from his laptop with a frown, watching Phoebe's behavior with growing concern. An elderly couple across the aisle exchanged worried looks. A woman 2 rows back leaned over to her husband and whispered something that made him shake his head in disgust. The energy in the cabin was shifting, the comfortable pre-flight atmosphere giving way to tension and unease. Everyone could feel it. Something was wrong. Something unfair was happening. Chichi felt the weight of all those eyes on her, felt the burning shame of being singled out even though she didn't understand why. Her parents had prepared her for many things. They'd taught her about racism in age-appropriate ways, had explained that some people might judge her based on her skin color, might treat her unfairly. But this was her first real experience of it, and the reality was so much worse than any explanation could have prepared her for. She was 7 years old, flying alone for the first time, excited to see her grandmother, and instead of being treated with the extra care and kindness that unaccompanied minors were supposed to receive, she was being treated like a criminal. like she'd done something wrong just by existing in that seat. The announcement came over the intercom: "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." It was time for the final cabin checks, time to ensure all passengers were seated with their seatbelts fastened, all bags properly stowed, all electronic devices in airplane mode. Phoebe moved through the cabin with mechanical efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. It was focused on that little girl in 3A, on the anger and resentment bubbling inside her, on the need to put this child in her place. And as she walked, a dark idea began to form. In the galley, away from passenger view, Phoebe grabbed a sticky note from the supply drawer. These notes were typically used for marking special meal requests or noting passenger preferences, innocent tools for better service. But Phoebe had something else in mind. She pulled out a pen and, with deliberate, bold strokes, wrote a single word on the yellow square: monkey. She wrote it in capital letters, pressing hard enough that the ink bled through slightly. She looked at it for a moment, a small, cruel smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This would teach that child. This would remind her where she really belonged. Mimi was preparing juice and water for distribution when she noticed Phoebe writing something. "What's that for?" she asked innocently. Phoebe folded the note partially, hiding the word. "Just a reminder for myself. Don't worry about it." But there was something in Phoebe's tone, something sharp and final, that made Mimi drop the subject. She'd learned not to push, learned that questioning Phoebe only made things uncomfortable. So she said nothing, even as that small voice in her head whispered that something wasn't right. Phoebe began her final walkthrough of the business class cabin, checking overhead bins, ensuring tray tables were up, confirming seatbelts were fastened. She moved with purpose, getting closer and closer to row 3, to Chichi's seat. The little girl was looking out the window, watching the ground crew remove the wheel chocks and signal to the cockpit. She was trying to recapture some of that earlier excitement, trying to push away the bad feelings and focus on the fact that she was about to fly, about to soar through the clouds on her way to her grandmother's warm embrace. Phoebe reached Chichi's row. She paused, glanced around to make sure no one was watching too closely, and then in one smooth, quick motion she reached up and pressed the sticky note onto Chichi's headrest, right behind where the little girl's head rested. The word monkey was now clearly visible to anyone who looked at Chichi's seat from behind or from the side. It was cruel, it was deliberate, it was designed to humiliate and dehumanize a 7-year-old child. Phoebe pressed it firmly to make sure it would stick, then stepped back, a smirk of satisfaction crossing her face before she schooled her features back into professional neutrality and moved on. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. The engines rumbled to life, that powerful sound that Chichi usually found thrilling. But right now she barely noticed. Something was making her uncomfortable, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like when you know someone is staring at you. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her position, turning her head slightly, and that's when she saw it. The yellow sticky note, right there on her headrest, close enough that she could read it clearly. Monkey. For a moment, Chichi just stared at it, her young mind trying to process what she was seeing. Why would someone put that there? What did it mean? She knew what a monkey was, of course. She'd seen them at the zoo, thought they were cute and funny. But something about seeing that word there, on her seat, written in those harsh capital letters, made her stomach twist with a feeling she'd never experienced before. It felt bad. It felt mean. It felt like it was supposed to hurt her, even if she didn't fully understand how or why. Her eyes began to sting with tears. Her hands, still clutching Spotty, began to tremble. She looked around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed the note, trying to understand if this was some kind of normal thing that happened on planes that she just didn't know about. But deep down, even at 7 years old, she knew. She knew this was directed at her. She knew it was meant to make her feel small and wrong and less than. She knew because of the way that flight attendant had been looking at her, talking to her, questioning her right to be in that seat. Chichi reached up with one small hand, her fingers trembling, and carefully peeled the sticky note off the headrest. She looked at it again as if hoping she'd misread it, as if hoping the letters might rearrange themselves into something kind. But they didn't. Monkey. The word stared back at her, harsh and ugly and mean. She felt hot tears spilling down her cheeks now, but she was quiet about it. She didn't wail or cry out. Her parents had taught her to be composed, to handle difficult situations with grace. So even as her heart broke, even as she experienced racism in its most direct and cruel form for the first time in her young life, she was silent. She crumpled the note in her small fist, squeezing it tight as if she could crush the hurt along with the paper. The tears kept coming, rolling down her round cheeks and dripping onto Spotty's fabric head. She buried her face against the stuffed giraffe's neck, trying to hide, trying to make herself small, trying to understand why someone would be so cruel to her when she'd done nothing wrong. All she'd done was board a plane. All she'd done was sit in her assigned seat. All she'd done was exist as herself, as Chichi Asala, a 7-year-old girl who loved her grandmother and stuffed animals and was excited about flying. Why was that wrong? Why did that deserve this? Cindy saw everything. From her seat in 2A, she had a partial view of Chichi's row, and she'd watched Phoebe's approach, had seen the quick motion of her hand, and now she could see the devastating aftermath. She saw Chichi remove the note, saw the little girl's shoulders begin to shake with silent tears, saw her try to hide her face. Cindy's expression hardened into something fierce and protective. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes blazed with anger. She'd suspected Phoebe was behaving inappropriately, but this was beyond inappropriate. This was cruel. This was racist. This was an adult deliberately trying to hurt a child, and Cindy would not stand for it. Even Mark, absorbed as he'd been in his work, had caught the tail end of what happened. He looked up just in time to see Chichi crumple the note and start crying. He couldn't see what was written on it, but he didn't need to. The whole situation had been wrong from the start, and now it had clearly escalated to something terrible. He shook his head in disgust, his mouth pressing into a grim line, but then he looked back at his laptop. He didn't want to get involved. He told himself it wasn't his business, that surely someone else would handle it, that he had work to do. It was a decision he would feel ashamed about later. Phoebe, standing near the front galley, watched Chichi's reaction with satisfaction. She saw the tears, saw the crumpled note, saw the child's distress, and she felt justified. In her twisted, bigoted mind, she'd put an uppity child in her place, had reminded her that business class wasn't for people like her. She turned away, busying herself with pre-flight preparations, feeling no remorse, no guilt, no recognition of the profound cruelty she'd just inflicted. The plane was approaching the runway now, the engines revving higher, preparing for takeoff. But Chichi wasn't thinking about flying anymore. She wasn't thinking about clouds or her grandmother or the adventure ahead. She was thinking about that word. Monkey. She was thinking about the way the flight attendant had looked at her with such dislike. She was thinking about how she'd been made to feel unwelcome, unwanted, wrong. And something else was stirring inside her, beneath the hurt and confusion. Something her parents had instilled in her. Dignity. Self-respect. The knowledge that she deserved better. Chichi wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She took several deep breaths, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was upset. She smoothed down her yellow sundress. She sat up straighter in her seat. And then, with a composure that would have made her parents incredibly proud, she reached up and pressed the call button above her seat. The soft chime echoed through the cabin, and within seconds a flight attendant appeared. But it wasn't Phoebe. Phoebe had deliberately stayed in the galley, sending Mimi instead, not wanting to deal with whatever request the child might have. Mimi approached with a nervous smile, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation but not brave enough to confront it. Yes, sweetie? Do you need something? Chichi looked up at her, and Mimi was struck by the tears still glistening on the little girl's face, by the dignity in her posture despite her obvious distress. Excuse me, ma'am, Chichi said, her voice quiet but steady, each word carefully pronounced. May I please move to a different seat? Mimi blinked, confused. Is something wrong with your seat? Is it uncomfortable? Chichi shook her head, still clutching the crumpled note in one hand and Spotty in the other. No, ma'am. The seat is fine. I just would like to sit somewhere else, please. There was something in the way she said it, a quiet insistence, that made Mimi realize this wasn't a simple request. Something had happened, something that had upset this child deeply. But Mimi didn't know what to do. She didn't have the authority to just move passengers around, especially not right before takeoff. I need to check with the lead flight attendant, Mimi said softly. Just one moment, okay? She hurried back to the galley where Phoebe was reviewing the passenger list one more time. The little girl in 3A wants to move seats, Mimi reported quietly. Phoebe's head snapped up, and for just a moment, something that looked like satisfaction flickered across her face. Does she now? Did she say why? Mimi shook her head. Just that she'd like to sit somewhere else. Phoebe set down her clipboard and made her way back to Chichi's seat, and there was something almost triumphant in her walk. She thought she'd won, thought she'd successfully driven the child out of business class where Phoebe believed she didn't belong. She stopped at Chichi's row and looked down at the little girl with that same fake sweetness that barely masked her disdain. I hear you'd like to change seats, sweetheart, Phoebe said, her tone dripping with false concern. Chichi nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking. Phoebe made a show of looking around the cabin, of checking her passenger list. Well, I'm very sorry, but business class is completely full. Every seat is taken. There's nowhere for you to move to up here. She let that sink in, let the implication hang in the air. Then she added, with a pause that was purely theatrical, unless, of course, you'd be more comfortable in economy? I'm sure we could find you a seat back there. The insult was crystal clear. She wasn't offering a solution. She was offering degradation. She was suggesting that Chichi belonged in the back of the plane with the cheaper seats, away from the passengers Phoebe deemed worthy of business class. She was using this child's request to move away from harassment as an opportunity to further shame her. It was breathtakingly cruel, and several passengers who overheard gasped quietly or made sounds of disapproval. Chichi felt fresh tears welling up, but she blinked them back. She lifted her chin slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion but still clear, still dignified. No, thank you. I'll stay here. 7 years old, and she was refusing to be driven from her seat. 7 years old, and she was standing her ground, even as tears streamed down her face, even as her small body shook with the effort of holding herself together. She would not give this cruel woman the satisfaction of seeing her run. She would not let herself be pushed to the back. Her father had booked this seat for her. This was where she belonged. Phoebe's expression soured. She'd expected the child to accept the offer, to flee to economy and out of her sight. The fact that Chichi was refusing, was insisting on staying, irritated her. Suit yourself, she said curtly, and walked away without another word, leaving Chichi alone with her tears and her crumpled note and her broken heart. But Chichi wasn't alone. Not really. Because Cindy had seen and heard everything, and she'd reached her limit. This had gone too far. This needed to stop. And if the airline staff wasn't going to protect this child, then Cindy would. She unbuckled her seatbelt despite the fact that they were about to take off, despite the rules about remaining seated. This was more important. She stood up, stepped into the aisle, and walked the few steps to Chichi's row. "Hi, sweetheart," Cindy said gently, her voice warm and kind in a way that made Chichi's tears fall harder because it was the first genuine kindness she'd experienced since boarding this plane. "My name is Cindy. I'm sitting right in front of you. Is it okay if I sit with you for a little while?" She gestured to the empty seat beside Chichi, the middle seat that hadn't been booked. Chichi nodded, grateful beyond words for this stranger's kindness. Cindy settled into the seat beside her, and before doing anything else, she reached over and gently placed her hand over Chichi's smaller one. "I saw what happened," Cindy said quietly, her voice low enough that only Chichi could hear but firm with conviction. "What that flight attendant did to you was wrong. Very, very wrong. And I want you to know that it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with her ugliness." Chichi's voice came out as a whisper. "Why did she call me that?" The question broke Cindy's heart because she could hear the genuine confusion in it, the innocence, the inability to comprehend why someone would be so cruel for no reason. How do you explain racism to a 7-year-old? How do you explain that some people carry hate in their hearts and inflict it on others, even on children? Cindy chose her words carefully. Because some people are cruel, honey. Some people judge others based on how they look instead of who they are. And that says everything about them and nothing about you. Do you understand? Chichi nodded slowly, though Cindy could see she was still processing, still hurting. "But you," Cindy continued, giving Chichi's hand a gentle squeeze, "you handled that with more grace than most adults could manage. You didn't yell or make a scene. You asked respectfully to move, and when you couldn't, you held your ground. That takes courage. That takes strength." Chichi looked up at Cindy with red, puffy eyes. "I still have it," she said softly, opening her fist to reveal the crumpled yellow note. Cindy's expression hardened again as she looked at that word, that slur written in bold black ink and meant to dehumanize a child. "May I see that?" Cindy asked gently. Chichi nodded and handed it over. Cindy carefully smoothed out the note, and though anger burned through her, she kept her voice calm. "I'm going to take a picture of this if that's okay with you. Because what she did is not okay and there should be a record of it." Chichi nodded again and Cindy pulled out her phone, quickly snapping a clear photo of the note with its hateful message. Evidence. Documentation. Proof that this had happened, that a flight attendant on Skyways International Airlines had racially harassed a 7-year-old passenger. Cindy folded the note carefully and tucked it into her own pocket. "This isn't your burden to carry," she told Chichi firmly. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Cindy asked, shifting to a gentler tone. "Chichi," the little girl replied quietly. "Chichi Asala." At the mention of the surname, something flickered in Cindy's eyes. Asala. She'd heard that name before, though she couldn't quite place where. It rang a bell somewhere in the back of her mind, something related to business or finance or maybe aviation. But she didn't push. That wasn't important right now. What mattered was this little girl sitting beside her, still trembling slightly, still trying to be brave. Well, Chichi Asala, it's very nice to meet you, though I wish it was under better circumstances, Cindy said with a small, sad smile. Where are you headed? Family visit. Chichi nodded, wiping her eyes again. I'm going to see my grandmother in London. I haven't seen her in a whole year. Her voice gained a little strength as she talked about her grandmother, as she focused on something happy instead of what had just happened. That sounds wonderful, Cindy said encouragingly. I bet she's so excited to see you. What's the first thing you're going to do when you get there? And just like that, Cindy began the gentle work of helping Chichi recover from the trauma she'd just experienced, of reminding her that one person's cruelty didn't define the world, that there was still kindness, still people who would stand up for what's right. The plane's engines roared louder as they reached the runway. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the standard announcements about flight time and altitude. Cindy quickly buckled herself into the middle seat, staying beside Chichi instead of returning to her own. If the flight attendants had a problem with it, they could say something, but Cindy doubted they would. Not after what had happened. Not with the way other passengers were now watching Phoebe with obvious disapproval. As the plane began its takeoff roll, racing down the runway and lifting into the sky, Chichi looked out the window at Legos falling away beneath them. Normally, this would have been the most exciting moment of the flight, the magical instant when the ground drops away and you're suddenly flying. But right now all Chichi could think about was that note, that word, that feeling of being unwanted and judged. She pressed closer to the window, and Cindy gently placed an arm around her shoulders, a protective gesture that said without words, "You're not alone, I'm here, you're safe." If you're watching this and your blood is boiling right now, if you can't believe what Phoebe just did to an innocent child, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to take a turn that will restore your faith in justice. Phoebe thought she'd gotten away with it. She thought she'd put this child in her place and that would be the end of it. But what she didn't know, what nobody on that plane knew yet, was exactly who Chichi Asala's father was. And when he found out what had happened to his daughter, when he learned that someone had dared to hurt his little girl, the consequences would be swift, severe, and absolutely devastating. What would you do if you witnessed something like this? Would you be like Cindy and intervene, or would you be like Mark and look away? Because what happens next is going to prove that sometimes, justice doesn't just happen, it has to be demanded. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, that smooth transition from the steady climb to the peaceful glide through the stratosphere. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers around the cabin began to relax, some opening laptops, others pulling out books or adjusting their seats for a nap. The flight attendants emerged from their jump seats to begin the beverage service, the cabin settling into the familiar rhythm of a long-haul flight. Outside Chichi's window, the world below had transformed into a patchwork of browns and greens, the curve of the African coastline visible in the distance. Under normal circumstances, she would have been mesmerized by the view, pressing her nose against the window and marveling at how small everything looked from up here. But these weren't normal circumstances. Chichi sat in her seat, Spotty clutched against her chest, with Cindy's comforting presence beside her. The older woman hadn't returned to her own seat, had instead stayed right there, a protective barrier between Chichi and the world that had suddenly become cruel and confusing. They'd been talking quietly, Cindy asking gentle questions about Chichi's grandmother, about school, about her favorite things, trying to ease the little girl back from the edge of that terrible hurt. And it was working slowly. Chichi's tears had dried, though her eyes were still puffy and red. Her voice had regained some of its natural brightness as she talked about how her grandmother made the best jollof rice in the world and told stories about her own childhood in Nigeria. But then Chichi remembered something. Her hand moved to her small backpack tucked under the seat in front of her, and she pulled it onto her lap. She unzipped the main compartment and reached inside, pulling out something that made Cindy's eyebrows rise in surprise. It was a smartphone, but not a cheap one, not some simplified kid's device with limited functions and chunky protective casing. This was a top-of-the-line smartphone, sleek and expensive, the kind that business executives carried. It looked almost comically large in Chichi's small hands, but she handled it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. Cindy couldn't help but comment. "That's quite a phone for someone your age." There was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity and a hint of surprise. Most 7-year-olds she knew had tablets for games or maybe basic phones for emergencies, but this was something else entirely. Chichi looked up at her with those big, innocent eyes and explained as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My daddy gave it to me. He said to call him if anything goes wrong. Her small fingers were already moving across the screen, unlocking it with a passcode, navigating to her contacts with practiced ease. Something in Cindy's chest tightened at those words. He said to call him if anything goes wrong. This child's father had given her a direct line to him, had made sure she knew she could reach him anytime, anywhere if she needed help. That spoke of a parent who was protective, who was present, who had resources. Cindy watched as Chichi scrolled through her contacts. There weren't many, just family members mostly, and stopped at one labeled simply Daddy with a heart emoji beside it. She pressed the call button without hesitation. The phone rang. What? Twice. Chichi held it to her ear, and Cindy could hear the faint sound of the ringtone from where she sat. 3 rings. 4. Then the call connected and a deep, rich voice came through, warm and immediately full of love. Princess, how's my girl? Even through the phone, even from where Cindy sat, she could hear the affection in that voice, could hear that this was a father who adored his daughter. Chichi's composure, which had been holding together through sheer willpower, crumbled the moment she heard her father's voice. Daddy? Her voice cracked, broke on that single word, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Daddy, something bad happened. She said it like only a child can, with that particular mixture of hurt and confusion and absolute trust that the parent on the other end would make everything better. Because that's what daddies did. They fixed things. They protected you. They made the bad things go away. The change in the man's voice was immediate and striking. The warmth remained, but it was joined by something else, something sharp and focused and dangerous. Tell Daddy everything. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered gently but with unmistakable authority. This was a man used to getting information, used to making decisions, used to taking action. And right now, his daughter was upset, which meant someone was about to face consequences. Chichi took a shaky breath and began to explain, using her 7-year-old vocabulary to describe what had happened. There's a flight attendant, and she keeps checking my boarding pass over and over, like she doesn't believe I'm supposed to be here. And she asked another flight attendant to check it too, and she said it loud so everyone could hear, and everyone was looking at me. Her words tumbled out faster now, the hurt and humiliation of the experience pouring through. And she asked if I was sure I was in the right seat, like maybe I made a mistake, but I didn't. Daddy. I have the boarding pass right here and it says 3A and that's where I am. Cindy could hear the man on the other end of the line, the sound of him moving, perhaps standing up quickly, perhaps pacing. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear the shift in energy even through the phone. Chichi continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper for the next part, as if saying it out loud made it more real, more painful. And then she put a paper on my seat, Daddy. A sticky note. And it said. She paused, struggling to get the word out. It said monkey. She called me a monkey. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It stretched for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Cindy watched Chichi's face, saw the little girl waiting for her father's response, saw her biting her lip nervously. When the voice came back, it had transformed completely. Gone was the warm, affectionate tone. What remained was cold, controlled fury, the kind of anger that doesn't shout but instead becomes deadly calm and absolutely terrifying. Which airline, baby? Chichi sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Skyways International, Daddy. Flight SA-447. She recited the information clearly, the way she'd been taught to remember important details. The man on the other end was clearly writing this down or perhaps typing it because Chichi could hear the faint clicking sound through the phone. And the flight attendant's name? He asked, his voice still that same controlled steel. Can you tell me her name, Princess? Chichi looked up and across the cabin to where Phoebe was working, distributing drinks and snacks with that same fake professional smile, completely unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. Chichi had a good memory, the kind of memory that came from being a bright, observant child. She'd noticed the name tag during all those interactions, had read it without even meaning to. Phoebe, she said clearly. Her name is Phoebe. Phoebe, the man repeated, and somehow he made the name sound like a curse, like a verdict. Okay, baby girl. Okay. Listen to Daddy now. Don't you worry about anything, do you hear me? Not one single thing. Daddy's going to handle this. Everything is going to be okay. His voice had softened again when speaking directly to his daughter, had returned to that protective, reassuring tone that fathers use when they want their children to feel safe. You just enjoy your flight, watch a movie, eat some snacks, and before you know it you'll be landing in London and Grandma will be there waiting for you with the biggest hug. Can you do that for me? Chichi nodded even though he couldn't see her, her voice small but trusting. "Yes, Daddy." "That's my brave girl," he said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "I love you so much, Princess. More than all the stars in the sky." It was clearly something he said to her often, a familiar phrase that brought a small, watery smile to Chichi's face. "I love you too, Daddy," she whispered. "More than all the stars in the sky." The call ended and Chichi slowly lowered the phone, holding it in her lap as if it were a lifeline to safety. Cindy reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. "Your daddy sounds like a good man," she said softly. Chichi nodded, some of the tension finally leaving her small body. "He's the best daddy in the whole world," she said with the absolute certainty that only a well-loved child can have. "He always keeps his promises. He said he'll handle it, so he will." What Chichi said with such simple faith, what she believed with her whole heart, was absolutely true. Her daddy would handle it. Because what Phoebe didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she went about her duties with that smug satisfaction still warming her chest, was exactly who she had just targeted. She didn't know that the little girl she'd called a monkey, the child she tried to humiliate and drive from her seat, was Chichi Asala. And more importantly, she didn't know who Chichi's father was. John Asala. The name might not mean much to the average person on the street, but in certain circles, in the worlds of business and finance and aviation, it carried enormous weight. John Asala was a Nigerian oil magnate who'd built his fortune from the ground up, starting with a single drilling operation 30 years ago and expanding into one of the largest private oil companies in West Africa. But he hadn't stopped there. He'd diversified, invested strategically, moved into real estate, telecommunications, and most recently aviation. He was a majority stakeholder in 3 African airlines, had seats on half a dozen corporate boards, and his business decisions could move markets. 6 months ago, John Asala had made a quiet but significant investment in Skyways International Airlines. $800 million to be precise. It was a strategic move, one that gave him substantial influence over the company's direction and operations. The deal had been structured carefully to keep his involvement somewhat low profile. He preferred operating behind the scenes, preferred wielding power without courting publicity. The investment had made him the second-largest private shareholder in Skyways, giving him a seat on the board and significant voting rights on major decisions. But there was something else about this investment, something that only a few people in John Asala's inner circle knew. His decision to put his 7-year-old daughter on a Skyways flight by herself, as an unaccompanied minor, hadn't been random. It had been a test. He'd wanted to see how his airline, because that's how he thought of it now as partially his, handled its most vulnerable passengers. Would they provide the extra care and attention that unaccompanied minors deserved? Would they make his daughter feel safe and valued? Would they uphold the standards of service that John expected from any company bearing his investment? The answer was now devastatingly clear. They had failed. Not just failed, they had catastrophically, horrifically failed in the worst way imaginable. An employee of Skyways International Airlines had racially harassed his daughter. Had targeted her, singled her out, questioned her right to be there, and ultimately placed a racial slur on her seat. His 7-year-old daughter had been called a monkey by an airline employee while under the airline's care. The test hadn't just revealed weaknesses in service. It had exposed rot, had uncovered the kind of racist behavior that should never exist anywhere but especially not in a company John Asala had invested in. The moment John ended the call with his daughter, he moved with the swift, decisive action of a man who'd built an empire and knew exactly how to wield his power. He was in his office in Lagos, a massive space on the top floor of Asala Tower with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His desk was a sleek expanse of dark wood, multiple monitors displaying stock prices and news feeds and business data. He'd been in a meeting when Chichi's call came through, but he'd immediately dismissed everyone when he saw her name on his screen. Now, alone in his office with rage burning cold in his chest, he began making calls. First, his legal team. John had a team of 6 lawyers on permanent retainer, experts in international law, aviation law, discrimination cases, and corporate litigation. His call to them was brief and precise. "I need you to pull everything on Skyways International Airlines. Employee policies, past discrimination complaints, incident reports, everything. And I need it within the hour." He explained what had happened to Chichi, his voice level but with an undercurrent of fury that made his legal team immediately understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a business matter. This was personal. And when things got personal for John Asala, heads rolled. Next, he called the CEO of Skyways International Airlines. James Hart was a British executive who'd been running the airline for 5 years, presiding over its expansion into African markets and its recent partnerships with major stakeholders like Chichi Asala. He was in a board meeting in London when his assistant rushed in with an urgent message. Chichi Asala was on the phone and said it couldn't wait. James excused himself, stepped into his private office, and picked up the call with professional cordiality. "John, good to hear from you. What can I? We need to talk. Now." John's voice cut through any pleasantries like a knife. "My daughter is currently on one of your flights, SA 447 from Lagos to London. She's traveling as an unaccompanied minor, which means she's under your airline's care and protection. And one of your flight attendants just racially harassed her." The silence on James' heart's end was the silence of a man watching his career flash before his eyes. What? "John, I'm sure there's been some." "There's been no misunderstanding," John said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming even more dangerous. "Your lead flight attendant, a woman named Phoebe, placed a note on my daughter's headrest calling her a monkey. My 7-year-old daughter. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" James' heart felt the blood drain from his face. "John, I am so incredibly sorry. This is absolutely unacceptable and we will—" "You're right, it's unacceptable," John interrupted. "And here's what's going to happen. I'm emailing the board right now with a full account of this incident. I'm having my legal team pull all employment records for this Phoebe. And I want a full investigation launched immediately. Do you understand me? Immediately." "Of course, absolutely. I'm not finished," John said, and James' heart fell silent. "I want her off my plane before it lands. I don't care how you do it. I don't care what protocols you have to bypass. When that flight touches down in London, I want that woman escorted off by security and I want her terminated." "And James?" "Yes. This isn't a request. This is me telling you how this is going to go. Because if it doesn't go exactly this way, if there's any attempt to sweep this under the rug or protect this employee, then you're going to find out exactly what it means when someone who owns a significant portion of your company decides they're unhappy with leadership. Are we clear?" James Hart, a man who'd negotiated with unions and governments and corporate raiders, felt genuine fear in that moment. "We're clear, John. Absolutely clear. I'll handle this personally." "See that you do," John said, and ended the call without another word. He immediately opened his email and began typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he composed a detailed message to every member of Skyways International's board of directors. He laid out exactly what had happened, sparing no detail. He attached the photo that Cindy had taken of the note, which Chichi had already sent to him during their call. He made it clear that this was not just a customer complaint but a fundamental failure of the airline's duty of care and a violation of discrimination laws in multiple jurisdictions. While his email sent, reaching board members across different time zones and immediately sending their phones buzzing with urgent notifications, John's legal team was already at work. They'd accessed Phoebe's employment records through legal channels, pulling her file from Skyway's HR database. And what they found made John's jaw clench even harder. This wasn't Phoebe's first offense. Not even close. There in her file were 3 previous complaints of discriminatory behavior, incidents that had been reported by passengers over her 12 years with the airline. The first complaint, from 8 years ago, came from a Nigerian businessman who'd reported that Phoebe had questioned his boarding pass multiple times and suggested he might be more comfortable in economy despite having a valid first-class ticket. The complaint had been noted in her file with a verbal warning. The second complaint, from 5 years ago, came from an Indian family who reported that Phoebe had ignored their service requests while promptly attending to other passengers, and had made comments about special meal requirements in a mocking tone. This complaint had resulted in a written warning and supposed retraining on cultural sensitivity. The third complaint, from just 2 years ago, came from a black woman who reported that Phoebe had asked her if she was sure she could afford the extra legroom seat she paid for, and had questioned whether her credit card was valid. This complaint had resulted in another written warning and a note in her file about addressing unconscious bias. But clearly nothing had changed. The warnings hadn't worked. The retraining hadn't worked. Or more likely, they'd never been taken seriously in the first place. Phoebe had been allowed to continue her pattern of behavior because she was otherwise a competent employee, because confronting racism was uncomfortable, because it was easier to file complaints away than to actually address the problem. John's legal team compiled all of this information and sent it to him in a detailed brief. As he read through the complaints, seeing the pattern of behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago, his resolve hardened even further. This wasn't just about what had happened to Chichi, though that alone would have been enough. This was about a systemic failure. This was about an airline that had allowed a racist employee to continue working, to continue harassing passengers, because dealing with the problem was inconvenient. "I want a full investigation," John told his legal team in a follow-up call. "I want to know everyone who saw these complaints and did nothing. I want to know whose decision it was to keep her employed. And I want her off my plane before it lands." His instruction was clear, unambiguous, and backed by the full weight of his position and resources. Within an hour of Chichi's phone call, John had mobilized an entire apparatus of legal and corporate power, all focused on one goal: justice for his daughter and accountability for those who'd failed to protect her. In London, James Hart was in emergency damage control mode. He'd immediately convened an emergency board meeting, conducted via satellite communication since members were scattered across the globe. The mood was grim. Several board members had already read John Asala's email, had seen the photo of that hateful note, and understood the severity of the situation. This wasn't just a PR crisis. This was a potential legal nightmare, a shareholder revolt, and a moral catastrophe all rolled into one. And it had happened to the daughter of one of their largest investors, a man who could make their lives very difficult if he chose to. "We need to act decisively," James told the assembled board members, their faces appearing on screens around his conference room. "I've already authorized the immediate termination of the employee in question. Airport security will be waiting when Flight SA-447 lands. She'll be escorted off the aircraft and her employment will be terminated on the spot." One of the board members, a woman from South Africa, spoke up. "What about the other complaints in her file? How did we allow this to continue?" James grimaced. "That's going to be part of a broader investigation. But right now, our priority is managing this immediate situation and ensuring the safety and well-being of the child in question." Back on the plane, cruising at 37,000 feet somewhere over the Sahara Desert, Phoebe had no idea that her entire life was being dismantled. She was busy preparing the meal service, heating up the business class entrees, arranging trays with practiced efficiency. She felt good, felt satisfied, felt like she'd successfully handled a situation that had made her uncomfortable. In her twisted worldview, she'd done nothing wrong. She'd simply reminded an uppity child of her place. She had no idea that 3,000 miles away, her employment records were being examined. She had no idea that the CEO of her company had just ordered her immediate termination. She had no idea that the little girl she'd targeted was the daughter of a man who could, with a single phone call, reshape the entire airline. She had no idea that her world was about to end. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, if you're waiting to see justice served and this horrible woman get exactly what she deserves, then smash that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next is going to be absolutely satisfying. Phoebe thought she had power because she wore a uniform and controlled a cabin. But she was about to learn that real power doesn't come from a position or a name tag. Real power comes from resources, from influence, from being able to make phone calls that change everything. And the little girl she tried to break? She was about to prove that even the smallest voice, when backed by love and justice, can bring down the mightiest walls. The plane continued its journey across the African continent, carrying Phoebe toward a reckoning she couldn't imagine and Chichi toward the vindication she deserved. And every minute that passed, every mile that brought them closer to London, the machinery of justice was grinding forward, unstoppable and absolute. What would you do if you had the power to hold someone accountable for their cruelty? Would you show mercy, or would you ensure they faced the full consequences of their actions? The flight continued smoothly for the next few hours, the business class cabin settling into that quiet lull that comes during long international flights. Passengers dozed, read, watched movies on their seatback screens. Chichi had calmed considerably with Cindy beside her, the two of them watching an animated film together, sharing a pair of headphones with a splitter Cindy had in her bag. The little girl had even managed to eat some of her meal, though her appetite wasn't what it normally would have been. Spotty sat in her lap, a constant source of comfort, and occasionally Chichi would lean against Cindy's shoulder, grateful for this stranger who'd become a guardian angel at 37,000 feet. Phoebe, meanwhile, continued her duties with that same smug satisfaction still warming her chest. She'd successfully defended her territory as she saw it, had put an uppity child in her place, and everything had returned to normal. She distributed meals, collected trash, refreshed drinks, all with her practiced professional smile. She avoided Chichi's row entirely, letting Mimi handle any requests from that area, but she felt no guilt about what she'd done. In her twisted mind, she'd been justified. She'd been right. And as the flight progressed with no immediate consequences, she became even more confident that nothing would come of it. Just another complaint that would get filed away and forgotten, if there was even a complaint at all. But then about 4.5 hours into the 6-hour flight, something unusual happened. The intercom crackled to life, and instead of the standard announcements about turbulence or weather or landing preparations, the captain's voice came through. And there was something different about his tone, something serious and urgent that made passengers look up from their books and movies, made conversation stop, made everyone pay attention. Senior Flight Attendant Phoebe, please report to the flight deck immediately. The announcement hung in the air, crisp and commanding. Senior Flight Attendant Phoebe to the flight deck immediately. Phoebe, who'd been in the rear galley organizing supplies, froze. Her hands stilled on the coffee packets she'd been counting. Being called to the flight deck mid-flight was unusual, very unusual. It typically only happened in emergencies or when there was a serious security concern. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had there been a medical emergency she wasn't aware of? A disruptive passenger in economy that needed her attention? Some kind of mechanical issue that required crew briefing? She smoothed down her uniform, checked her appearance in the reflective surface of the galley equipment, and composed her face into professional readiness. Whatever this was, she'd handle it with her usual competence. She walked through the cabin toward the front of the plane, her posture confident, almost strutting, completely unaware that every step was bringing her closer to the end of everything she knew. As she passed through business class, she didn't even glance at Chichi's row, didn't notice the way Cindy watched her with narrowed eyes, didn't see the flicker of recognition and understanding that crossed the older woman's face. Cindy had been around long enough, had worked in corporate environments long enough, to recognize what was happening. That announcement, that tone, the timing of it all, this wasn't routine. This was a reckoning. In the galley near the cockpit, Mimi and another flight attendant named Sarah exchanged worried glances. They'd both heard the captain's tone, had both felt the unusual tension in that announcement. "What do you think that's about?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with concern. Mimi shook her head, but her stomach was churning with anxiety. She thought about that little girl in 3A, about the way Phoebe had been treating her, about that moment when Phoebe had been writing something on a sticky note. Mimi hadn't seen what was written, but she'd seen the cruel smile on Phoebe's face, and she'd felt in her gut that something wrong was happening. "I don't know," Mimi whispered back, but her voice carried the weight of someone who suspected exactly what this was about. Phoebe reached the cockpit door and used the intercom system to announce herself. "This is Phoebe. You called for me?" The door unlocked with a mechanical click, and she stepped into the flight deck. The cockpit was a tight space filled with instruments and displays, bathed in the soft glow of various indicator lights. The captain sat in the left seat, the first officer in the right, and both men turned to look at her as she entered. The captain was a veteran pilot in his late 50s, a man named David Chin who'd been flying for Skyways for 20 years. His face was grave, his jaw set in a hard line, and there was no warmth in his eyes as he regarded Phoebe. "Close the door," he said, his voice clipped and professional but carrying an undercurrent of something that made Phoebe's confidence waver slightly. She closed the door behind her, sealing them in the small space. "Sir, you called for me? Is there an emergency?" Captain Chen's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes fixed forward on the endless expanse of sky and clouds, but when he spoke, each word was measured and deliberate. "Phoebe, you're being relieved of duty effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "What? I don't understand. Why?" Captain Chin finally turned to look at her directly, and she saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. Disgust. Contempt. Disappointment. "There's been a serious complaint filed against you. A very serious complaint involving a minor passenger. I've received direct orders from corporate headquarters to remove you from service for the remainder of this flight." Phoebe's mind reeled. A complaint? From who? About what? And then, like ice water down her spine, she thought of that little black girl in 3A. But that was impossible. The child was 7 years old, traveling alone. Who would she have complained to? How would corporate headquarters even know about anything that happened on this flight while they were still in the air? "I don't know what you're talking about," Phoebe said, but her voice had lost its confidence, had taken on a defensive edge. "I've done nothing wrong. I've been performing my duties exactly as." "You're not to interact with any passengers for the remainder of this flight," Captain Chin interrupted, his voice hard as steel. "You'll remain in the rear crew rest area until we land at Heathrow. Upon landing, you'll be escorted off the aircraft by airport security. Those are my orders and those are the orders from corporate. Is that clear?" Phoebe's face had drained of all color. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the panic underneath. This is ridiculous. I have a right to know what I'm being accused of. I have a right to defend myself. You can't just. I can and I am, the captain said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're dismissed from this flight deck. Go to the rear crew rest area and stay there. Do not speak to passengers. Do not speak to other crew members about this. Just wait until we land. He turned back to his instruments, effectively ending the conversation. The first officer, who'd been silent throughout this exchange, gave Phoebe a look that was equal parts pity and reproach before he too turned away. Phoebe stood there for a moment, frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Then, with trembling hands, she opened the cockpit door and stumbled back into the cabin. The walk from the cockpit to the rear of the plane was the longest of Phoebe's life. Her legs felt unsteady, her breath came in short gasps, and she could feel the eyes of passengers and crew members on her as she passed. Mimi started to approach her, concern written all over her face, but Phoebe held up a hand to stop her, unable to speak, afraid that if she opened her mouth she might start screaming or crying or both. She made it to the rear crew rest area, a small compartment with a fold-down seat and barely enough room to turn around, and closed the door behind her. Then she collapsed onto the seat, her mind racing, her heart pounding, and for the first time real fear began to set in. What had happened? How had this spiraled so far so fast? She thought back through her shift, through every interaction, and kept coming back to that little girl. But it didn't make sense. The child was nobody, nothing, just some kid who shouldn't have been in business class in the first place. How could she possibly have the power to get Phoebe removed from duty mid-flight? How could corporate headquarters even know what happened while they were still in the air? Unless someone had called. Unless someone had complained. Unless that child wasn't as powerless as Phoebe had assumed. For the next 90 minutes, Phoebe sat in that tiny crew rest area, listening to the muffled sounds of the cabin, feeling the slight changes in the plane's altitude as they began their descent toward London, and slowly coming to the realization that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She thought about her 12 years with Skyways, her perfect attendance record, her commendations. She thought about her pension, her benefits, her career. And she thought about that note, that stupid sticky note with one cruel word that had seemed so justified in the moment but now felt like it might cost her everything. The plane began its final descent into Heathrow Airport. The seatbelt signs came on, the cabin crew, now working without their senior flight attendant, moved through the cabin ensuring passengers were prepared for landing. Chichi looked out her window at the grey skies of London, at the patchwork of fields and roads and buildings growing larger as they descended. Cindy squeezed her hand gently. Almost there, sweetheart. Your grandmother is going to be so happy to see you. Chichi nodded, and despite everything that had happened, a small smile touched her lips at the thought of her grandmother's hug. The landing was smooth, the tires kissing the runway with barely a bump, the reverse thrusters roaring as the plane slowed. They taxied to their gate, and the familiar sounds of passengers unbuckling seatbelts and opening overhead bins filled the cabin. But there was an unusual energy in the air, a tension that the regular passengers couldn't quite identify but could definitely feel. Something was different about this arrival. Something was happening. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow. Please remain seated for a moment while we allow some special services personnel to board. This was unusual enough that passengers exchanged confused glances, murmuring questions to each other. Special services? What did that mean? The aircraft door opened, and instead of passengers immediately disembarking, a team of people entered. There were 2 representatives from Skyway's Special Services Division, easily identified by their distinctive uniforms and badges. Behind them came 2 members of airport security in their high-visibility vests. And behind them, most ominously, came 2 officers from the Metropolitan Police in full uniform, their presence immediately commanding attention and causing a ripple of shocked whispers through the cabin. The Special Services team moved directly to Chichi's row. Miss Asala, one of them said gently, a kind-faced woman in her 40s with warm eyes. We're here to escort you to meet your family. Would you come with us, please? Chichi looked at Cindy, who nodded encouragingly. It's okay, sweetheart. These are the good guys. They're going to take you to your grandmother. Chichi stood, clutching Spotty, and the woman from Special Services took her small hand gently. We'll get your luggage for you, don't worry about anything. As they led Chichi off the plane, giving her priority disembarkment, passengers watched in confusion and curiosity. Who was this little girl that she warranted such special treatment? Why the security presence? Why the police? The answers wouldn't become clear until later, until the news stories broke, until the world learned what had happened on Flight SA-447. But right now, Chichi was being led through the jet bridge and into the terminal where her grandmother waited, and where a legal representative from her father's firm stood ready to document everything and ensure her well-being. Back on the plane, the police officers and airport security had moved to the rear, to the crew rest area where Phoebe still sat, her face pale and her hands shaking. There was a firm knock on the door. "Phoebe Morrison? Please open the door." Phoebe's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She opened the door to find herself facing 2 police officers and 2 security personnel, all of whom regarded her with professional seriousness. "Phoebe Morrison?" one of the officers repeated. She nodded, unable to find her voice. "We need you to come with us, please." "Am I under arrest?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not at this moment," the officer replied, "but we need to question you regarding an incident that occurred on this flight. You're required to come with us." Phoebe had no choice. She gathered her small bag, her hands still trembling, and allowed herself to be escorted off the plane. As she walked through the business class cabin, every passenger still on board watched her. They saw her face, pale and frightened. They saw the police escort. And they began to piece together that something serious had happened on their flight, something that had consequences, something that involved law enforcement. Mimi watched from the galley as Phoebe was led away, and the full weight of what had happened finally crashed down on her. She thought about all the times she'd seen Phoebe treat passengers differently based on their race, all the times she'd heard the subtle insults and microaggressions, all the times she'd said nothing because it was easier, because she needed her job, because speaking up seemed too risky. And now she understood with crystal clarity that her silence had been complicity. Her failure to report, her failure to intervene, her failure to stand up for what was right, it had all contributed to creating an environment where Phoebe felt empowered to do something as horrific as what she'd done to that little girl. Mimi felt sick to her stomach, felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, and vowed right then that she would never again stay silent in the face of injustice. Phoebe was taken to a secure room in the airport, a small, windowless space typically used for questioning potential security threats or dealing with unruly passengers. The police officers sat across from her at a plain metal table, and one of them pulled out a recording device. "This interview is being recorded. Please state your name for the record." "Phoebe Morrison," she said, her voice hollow. "Ms. Morrison, we need to ask you about your interactions with a minor passenger on flight SA-447 from Lagos to London. Specifically, a 7-year-old girl named Chichi Asala." And there it was. The name that would haunt Phoebe for the rest of her life. They asked her to recount her interactions with the passenger. They asked about the boarding pass checks, about her questions regarding the child's right to be in business class, about her tone and demeanor. And then they asked about the note. "Did you place a piece of paper on or near the passenger's seat?" Phoebe's mouth went dry. She could lie, but they clearly already knew the truth. They wouldn't be asking if they didn't have evidence. It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." "A joke?" The officer's voice was flat, unamused. "You placed a note calling a 7-year-old child a racial slur, and you're claiming it was a joke? I didn't think. I mean, she wouldn't have even understood." Phoebe's excuses sounded pathetic even to her own ears. "The child understood enough to be distressed, Ms. Morrison. We have witness statements from other passengers. We have photographic evidence of the note. And we have the child's own testimony. Now, I'm going to ask you directly, did you write and place a note with the word, monkey, on or near this child's seat?" Phoebe closed her eyes, and the last of her denial crumbled away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I did." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them pulled out a formal document. "Phoebe Morrison, I'm arresting you on suspicion of racially aggravated harassment of a minor, assault by causing psychological harm to a child, and violation of the Equality Act 2010. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." The formal caution washed over her like cold water, each word a nail in the coffin of her life as she'd known it. "You're actually arresting me?" she asked, incredulous even now, even with the evidence stacked against her, even with her own admission. The officer's expression was stern. "Ms. Morrison, you racially harassed a child in your care. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Phoebe had no answer. They fitted her with handcuffs, not roughly but firmly, and led her out of the interview room and through the secure corridors of Heathrow Airport, away from the public areas, toward a police vehicle that would transport her to a station for formal booking and processing. Meanwhile, in the arrivals hall, Chichi had been reunited with her grandmother, a beautiful older woman named Grace who swept her granddaughter into an embrace so tight and loving that it made up for every terrible moment of that flight. "My baby, my sweet baby," Grace murmured, kissing the top of Chichi's head over and over. The legal representative from John Asala's firm stood nearby, documenting the reunion, taking notes, ensuring that everything was handled properly. He'd already taken Chichi's statement, gentle and careful to not re-traumatize her, and had collected the crumpled note that Cindy had preserved as evidence. Cindy had been allowed to disembark and had given her own statement to authorities, providing her photographs and her witness account. Before she left, she stopped by where Chichi stood with her grandmother. "Hi again, sweetheart," Cindy said with a warm smile. Chichi looked up and immediately reached out to hug her. "Thank you for being nice to me," the little girl said, her voice muffled against Cindy's jacket. "Thank you for sitting with me." Cindy knelt down to Chichi's level, her eyes a little misty. "You're a remarkable young lady, Chichi Asala. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. You're extraordinary." Grace looked at Cindy with deep gratitude. "Thank you for looking after my grandbaby." Cindy nodded, squeezed Chichi's hand one more time, and then gathered her bags to continue on with her journey. But she knew she'd carry the memory of that little girl's courage for the rest of her life. She knew that what she'd witnessed would stay with her, would remind her to always speak up, to always intervene, to always stand on the side of justice. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind that would completely dismantle Phoebe Morrison's life. She was formally charged with racially aggravated harassment of a minor, assault by causing psychological harm, and violation of the Equality Act. The Crown Prosecution Service, recognizing the severity of the offense and the vulnerability of the victim, fast-tracked the case. Phoebe's lawyer tried to argue for leniency, tried to characterize it as a moment of poor judgment, tried to highlight her 12 years of service. But the evidence was overwhelming. The note existed. Multiple witnesses corroborated the story. Chichi's testimony, delivered via recorded video interview conducted by specially trained officers who worked with child witnesses, was clear and heartbreaking. And there was something else that sealed Phoebe's fate: her employment record. John Asala's legal team had provided all of those previous complaints to the authorities, showing a pattern of discriminatory behavior. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern of racism that had been allowed to continue, that had escalated, that had finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored or explained away. The judge who presided over Phoebe's hearing was a stern black woman named Justice Okonkwo, and she didn't mince words in her ruling. "Ms. Morrison, you held a position of trust and authority. You were responsible for the care and safety of passengers, including vulnerable unaccompanied minors. And you abused that position in the most egregious way possible by targeting a 7-year-old child with racist harassment. Your actions were deliberate, cruel, and have caused significant psychological harm to a young person who should have been under your protection. The court finds you guilty on all charges." Phoebe Morrison was sentenced to 8 months in prison. She was also ordered to pay restitution for emotional distress, though the Asala family made it clear they'd donate any money received to organizations fighting racism in aviation. But the prison sentence was only the beginning of Phoebe's unraveling. Skyways International Airlines, acting swiftly to protect their reputation and demonstrate their zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, terminated her employment immediately upon her arrest. She lost her job, her benefits, and her pension. 12 years of service erased in an instant. The Civil Aviation Authority, the regulatory body overseeing UK aviation, launched their own investigation and ultimately revoked Phoebe's aviation credentials, banning her from working in any capacity in the airline industry permanently. She would never work as a flight attendant again. She would never even be allowed to work at an airport in any role. The story broke in the media within days. Flight attendant arrested for racist attack on 7-year-old passenger. Skyways employee jailed for placing racial slur on child seat. Aviation industry rocked by discrimination scandal. News outlets across the UK, across Europe, across the world picked up the story. Phoebe Morrison's name became synonymous with racism in aviation. Her photograph was published in newspapers and websites, her face becoming known as the woman who'd called a child a monkey, who'd let her hatred overcome her professionalism, who'd traumatized an innocent little girl. Her personal life crumbled too. Friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone whose actions had been so publicly condemned. Her family was humiliated, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. Even after she served her 8 months and was released from prison, she found that rebuilding was impossible. Job applications were rejected the moment employers Googled her name. Apartments she tried to rent denied her once landlords realized who she was. She'd become a pariah, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when racism is allowed to fester and finally explodes into undeniable action. And all of it, every consequence, every loss, every moment of that unraveling traced back to one decision. One cruel moment when she'd looked at a 7-year-old girl and decided to hurt her. One sticky note with one hateful word. That's all it took to destroy a career, a reputation, a life. Phoebe had thought she had power because of her uniform and her position. She thought she could treat people differently based on their skin color without consequences. She thought wrong. If you've been with this story from the beginning, if you've felt every moment of Chichi's hurt and Phoebe's downfall, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now because we tell stories of justice, of standing up for what's right, of consequences for those who abuse their power. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Because this is what accountability looks like. This is what happens when people refuse to stay silent. This is what happens when a little girl's father has the resources and the determination to ensure his daughter gets justice. What would you do if you were in Phoebe's shoes right now, facing the consequences of your hatred? Would you finally understand the damage you'd caused, or would you still try to justify it? 3 days after that fateful flight, after the arrest, after the media storm began, after the wheels of justice had been set irrevocably in motion, Chichi Asala stood in the arrivals hall of London Heathrow Airport once again. But this time he wasn't sending his daughter off on a test of airline services. This time he was coming to hold her, to reassure her, to remind her of who she was and whose she was. He'd caught the first available flight from Lagos the moment everything had been set in motion, leaving his team to handle the legal proceedings while he focused on what mattered most, his daughter. Chichi Asala was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention the moment he entered a room. He wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, a watch on his wrist that cost more than most people's cars. But despite all the markers of wealth and power, despite the aura of authority that surrounded him like a force field, the expression on his face as he waited for his daughter was one of pure, undiluted love mixed with protective fury. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and his eyes scanned the crowd with an intensity that made people instinctively step out of his way. Grace, his mother and Chichi's grandmother, had kept the little girl close since her arrival, had surrounded her with warmth and comfort and all the familiar things that made her feel safe. They'd spent time baking chin-chin together in Grace's kitchen, had watched Chichi's favorite movies, had talked about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding the trauma of the flight until Chichi was ready to process it. Grace had raised John to be a man of principle and action, had taught him that when someone hurts your family, you don't just get angry, you get effective. And she'd seen that effectiveness play out over the past 72 hours as her son had systematically dismantled the life of the woman who dared to hurt her grandbaby. When Chichi saw her father, when she spotted that familiar figure standing head and shoulders above most of the crowd, something inside her that had been holding itself together finally released. "Daddy," she cried out, and she broke away from her grandmother's hand and ran as fast as her 7-year-old legs could carry her, her yellow dress, a fresh one that Grace had bought her, to replace the one tainted by bad memories, flowing behind her, Spotty clutched tight in one arm. John dropped to one knee, his arms open wide, and caught his daughter as she launched herself into his embrace. He wrapped his arms around her small body and held her so tight, as if he could shield her from every bad thing in the world through sheer force of love. "My princess, my baby girl," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Chichi buried her face in his shoulder and finally let herself cry in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry before. These weren't the quiet, confused tears of the plane or the shocked tears of processing what had happened. These were the deep, cathartic sobs of a child who knew she was safe now, who knew her daddy had come and made everything right, who could finally release all the hurt and fear and confusion she'd been carrying. John held her through it all, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other rubbing soothing circles on her back, making soft shushing sounds that weren't meant to stop her tears but rather to let her know he was there, he had her, she was safe. Grace stood nearby, her own eyes misty, watching her son comfort her granddaughter and feeling proud of the man she'd raised and heartbroken for what her grandbaby had endured. Other people in the arrivals hall glanced over, some with curiosity, some with sympathy, but Chichi Asala didn't care about any of them. His entire world had narrowed to the small, sobbing girl in his arms. When Chichi's tears finally began to subside, When her breathing had calmed from those hitching sobs to small, shuddering breaths, John gently pulled back just enough to look at her face. He cupped her cheeks in his large hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that still clung to her skin. "Look at me, baby," he said softly. Chichi opened her red, puffy eyes and met her father's gaze. "You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. Not one single thing." "But Daddy," she kept checking my boarding pass like I wasn't supposed to be there, Chichi said, her voice small and uncertain. "She made me feel like I was bad." John's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching as he fought to control the anger that threatened to overwhelm his calm. But when he spoke to his daughter, his voice remained gentle, controlled, filled only with love and certainty. "You weren't bad. You aren't bad. You're perfect exactly as you are. That woman, she's the one who was wrong. She's the one who did something bad. And she's paying for it now, and she'll keep paying for it." He stood, lifting Chichi with him even though she was getting big for that, and carried her over to a quiet seating area away from the main traffic flow. Grace followed, settling beside them as John sat down with Chichi in his lap, adjusting her so she was comfortable, so she could see his face clearly. This was going to be a hard conversation, one of those conversations that no parent wants to have with their 7-year-old, but it was necessary. Chichi needed to understand what had happened and why, needed to have language for the hatred she'd encountered, needed to know how to carry herself forward. "Chichi, my love, we need to talk about something important," John began, choosing his words carefully. "Do you know what prejudice is?" Chichi thought for a moment, her forehead wrinkling in concentration the way it always did when she was thinking hard about something. "Is it when people judge you before they know you?" John smiled slightly, impressed as always by his daughter's intelligence. "That's exactly right. And sometimes people judge others based on things that don't matter, like the color of their skin. That's called racism." "Is that what the lady did to me?" Chichi asked quietly. "Did she not like me because I'm black?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, made both John and Grace's hearts clench painfully. "Yes, baby," John said honestly, because he'd always believed in telling his daughter the truth in age-appropriate ways. "That woman looked at your beautiful brown skin and decided you weren't good enough to sit in that seat. She was wrong, so very wrong, but that's what hatred does to people. It makes them act in cruel, stupid ways." Chichi was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "Daddy, did I do the right thing? Calling you? Some kids at school say tattling is bad, and I don't want to be a tattletale." John took both of her small hands in his much larger ones and looked directly into her eyes with an intensity that made sure she understood every word he was about to say. "Listen to me very carefully, princess. There's a difference between tattling and telling. Tattling is when you try to get someone in trouble for something small that doesn't really matter. Telling is when you report something wrong, something harmful, something that needs to be stopped. What you did was telling. What you did was standing up for yourself. And I am so proud of you." "Really?" Chichi's voice was still uncertain, still seeking reassurance. "Really," John confirmed firmly. "You did exactly right. When someone treats you badly, when someone tries to make you feel less than you are, you speak up. You never, ever accept mistreatment. Never. Do you understand me?" Chichi nodded slowly. "But Daddy, what if speaking up makes people mad? What if they don't like me?" Grace reached over and gently touched her granddaughter's cheek. "Sweet girl, people who treat others badly, people who do wrong things, they're going to be mad when they get caught. But that's not your problem. That's their problem. You don't stay quiet to make mean people comfortable." John continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone imparting a crucial life lesson, something he wanted his daughter to carry with her always. "Chichi, baby, some people in this world are going to try to make you feel small because of how you look. They're going to judge you before they know you. They're going to assume things about you that aren't true. They're going to try to put you in a box, to limit you, to tell you that you don't belong in certain spaces." He paused, making sure she was still following, and saw her nodding, understanding far more than any 7-year-old should have to understand about the ugly realities of the world. "But you, my princess," John said, his voice swelling with conviction and pride, "you are mighty. You are brilliant and kind and brave. You are the daughter of kings and queens, of ancestors who survived and thrived against impossible odds. You carry their strength in your bones, their wisdom in your spirit. When someone tries to make you feel small, you remember who you are. You remember whose you are. You stand tall, you speak clearly, and you never, ever let anyone convince you that you're less than extraordinary. Because you're not. You're exceptional." Tears were rolling down Chichi's cheeks again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of healing, of being seen and valued and loved so completely that the hurt began to lose its power. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, throwing her arms around his neck. "I love you too, baby girl," John replied, his own voice rough with emotion. "More than all the stars in the sky. And I will always, always protect you. Anyone who tries to hurt you will answer to me. Always." They sat like that for a long time, father and daughter and grandmother, a tight family unit bound by love and shared heritage and the determination to never let hatred win. Eventually, they gathered their things and made their way to Grace's car for the drive to her home in North London. But John Asala's work was far from over. Protecting his daughter meant more than just comforting her and bringing her tormentor to justice. It meant making sure this never happened again to her or to anyone else. Over the next several weeks, John used every bit of influence he had as the second-largest private shareholder of Skyways International Airlines to implement sweeping, systemic changes. He didn't just want Phoebe Morrison punished. He wanted the culture that had allowed her behavior to continue for 12 years to be completely dismantled and rebuilt. His first action was to mandate comprehensive anti-discrimination training for every single employee of Skyways International, from the CEO down to the newest baggage handler. Not the token checkbox training that many companies did to say they'd done something, but real, substantive training developed by experts in implicit bias and systemic racism. He brought in consultants who specialized in creating inclusive workplace cultures, people who'd helped major corporations identify and root out discriminatory practices. The training wasn't optional, and it wasn't a one-time thing. It became an ongoing requirement with annual refreshers and regular assessments. Employees who didn't take it seriously, who didn't demonstrate genuine understanding and commitment to change, found themselves without jobs. John made it clear that Skyways would be a model for the entire aviation industry, a place where discrimination wasn't just discouraged but actively impossible to sustain. The second major change was the implementation of a zero-tolerance policy for any form of racial, ethnic, religious, or other discrimination. The policy was clear and unambiguous. One verified incident of discriminatory behavior would result in immediate termination, no second chances, no probationary periods, no opportunities to learn and grow while still employed. If you harassed passengers or colleagues based on protected characteristics, you were gone. The policy included robust reporting mechanisms that protected whistleblowers and encouraged people to speak up when they witnessed problematic behavior. John also insisted on the creation of a passenger advocate office, an independent department within Skyways that passengers could contact directly with concerns or complaints about their treatment. This office had real power. They could launch investigations, recommend disciplinary action, and report directly to the board of directors. They weren't buried in the corporate structure where complaints could be quietly filed away and forgotten. They were visible, accessible, and empowered to create change. John personally oversaw the hiring of the office's director, choosing a woman named Dr. Amara Obi, a Nigerian-British human rights lawyer with a reputation for taking no nonsense and fighting tirelessly for justice. Cindy, the passenger who'd sat beside Chichi and documented what happened, was formally recognized by Skyways for her intervention. John personally called her, thanked her for protecting his daughter when he couldn't be there, and Skyways presented her with a commendation and lifetime platinum status on the airline. But more than the perks, Cindy was invited to speak at Skyways' first company-wide anti-discrimination training, where she told the story of what she'd witnessed and challenged every employee to consider whether they would have had the courage to intervene or whether they would have looked away like so many others did. The crumpled sticky note with its hateful word, the piece of evidence that had been so carefully preserved, took on a symbolic significance beyond its role in Phoebe's conviction. John donated it to the International Civil Rights Museum, where it became part of an exhibit on modern racism and the ongoing fight for dignity and equality. That small yellow square of paper, with its cruel message written in bold black ink, stood as a stark reminder that racism wasn't just a historical problem, that it existed in everyday interactions, in small moments of cruelty that could devastate a child's sense of self-worth. But it also represented something else: accountability, consequences, and the power of speaking up. The changes John implemented rippled far beyond Skyways International. Other airlines, seeing the media coverage of the incident and the decisive action taken in response, began examining their own policies and practices. Aviation industry conferences suddenly featured panels on diversity and inclusion. Flight attendant training programs added modules on recognizing and combating implicit bias. What had started as one man's determination to get justice for his daughter became a catalyst for industry-wide change. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't complete, but it was movement in the right direction, proof that individual actions could spark collective transformation. Months passed. Chichi returned to her normal life in Lagos, back to her school and her friends and her routines. She still loved airplanes, still got excited about flying, though her parents noticed she paid more attention now to how flight attendants treated different passengers. She developed a keen eye for fairness, for equality, for the small ways people showed respect or disrespect to others. Her experience hadn't broken her spirit. If anything, it had strengthened her sense of justice and her willingness to speak up when things weren't right. She'd learned, at 7 years old, that her voice mattered, that standing up for herself was right and necessary, that she didn't have to accept mistreatment just because someone had authority over her. John watched his daughter closely in those months, alert for any signs of lasting trauma, ready to get her whatever help she needed. There were some nightmares at first, some moments of anxiety when they went to the airport. But Chichi was resilient, surrounded by love and support, and she processed what had happened with the help of a wonderful child psychologist who specialized in helping kids make sense of experiences with discrimination. Slowly, steadily, Chichi healed. The hurt didn't disappear entirely, experiences like that leave marks, but it became integrated into her story rather than defining her story. She was Chichi Asala, smart, kind, brave, and now aware that the world contained both cruelty and justice, both people who would try to diminish her and people who would stand up for her. Phoebe Morrison, meanwhile, was serving her 8-month sentence in a women's prison outside London. The conditions weren't harsh by any means. UK prisons, particularly for non-violent offenders, focused on rehabilitation, but the loss of freedom, the loss of identity, the constant confrontation with what she'd done, all of it weighed on her. Other inmates knew her story, it had been in all the papers. Some were sympathetic, recognizing their own struggles with prejudice and poor choices. Others were disgusted, particularly those who were mothers who couldn't fathom deliberately hurting a child. Phoebe attended mandatory counseling sessions where she was forced to examine her beliefs, her biases, the roots of her racism. It was uncomfortable, painful work that she resisted at first but slowly, grudgingly began to engage with. The question of whether Phoebe genuinely changed, whether she truly understood the depth of harm she'd caused and worked to become better, or whether she simply learned to hide her prejudice more carefully, that's a question without a simple answer. People are complex. Redemption is possible but not guaranteed, and it requires genuine work, genuine humility, genuine commitment to change. What was certain was that Phoebe would spend the rest of her life living with the consequences of one cruel moment, one decision to let her hatred overcome her humanity. Her name would forever be associated with racism. Her career was over. Her reputation destroyed. Whether she became a better person or simply a more careful bigot, she would never escape what she'd done. Chichi Asala was just 7 years old when she learned one of life's most important lessons. That dignity isn't something that's given to you by others, something you have to earn or beg for or hope someone decides you're worthy of receiving. Dignity is something you claim for yourself. It's something you assert, something you demand, something you refuse to surrender no matter how hard someone tries to strip it away. When that flight attendant placed that note on her seat, when Phoebe Morrison tried to reduce her to a slur, to make her feel less than human, Chichi could have internalized that message. She could have believed it, could have let it shape how she saw herself. But she didn't. She knew, with the certainty that comes from being deeply loved and valued at home, that what Phoebe said about her wasn't true. And she spoke up. She told. She demanded that the wrong be made right. That's dignity. Chichi also learned that speaking up isn't causing trouble, it's demanding respect. So many of us, children and adults alike, are taught to be quiet, to not make waves, to accept mistreatment gracefully because calling it out might make someone uncomfortable. But silence in the face of injustice doesn't keep the peace, it just lets the injustice continue. When Chichi pressed that call button, when she asked to move seats, when she called her father and told him what happened, she wasn't being difficult or dramatic or oversensitive. She was advocating for herself. She was refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. She was using her voice as a tool for change. And the world became a little bit better because she did. Phoebe Morrison thought she had power because of her position, because she wore a uniform and had authority in that cabin, because she could decide who got good service and who got treated with suspicion and disdain. She thought the trappings of her role gave her the right to judge others, to treat them as less than, to inflict her prejudices without consequence. But she learned, in the most devastating way possible, that positional power is nothing compared to real power. Real power comes from character, from integrity, from treating every human being with the dignity they inherently possess simply by virtue of being human. Real power comes from standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, from protecting the vulnerable, from refusing to participate in systems of oppression. Real power comes from being a 7-year-old girl who, despite her fear and hurt and confusion, doesn't back down, doesn't accept cruelty, doesn't let hatred have the last word. Real power comes from being a father who uses his resources and influence not just to enrich himself but to create systemic change that protects others. Real power comes from being a stranger on a plane who chooses to sit beside a crying child instead of looking away, who documents injustice instead of pretending not to see it. That's the power that changes the world. Not the power to hurt but the power to heal. Not the power to exclude but the power to include. Not the power to diminish but the power to uplift. Today Chichi Asala is thriving. She's growing up surrounded by love, guided by parents who teach her to be proud of her heritage, confident in her worth and committed to justice. She's a bright, joyful child who still loves airplanes and still travels with her stuffed giraffe's body. The experience on Flight SA-447 didn't break her spirit. Instead, it revealed the strength that was always there, the courage that comes from knowing you're loved and valued, the determination to never accept less than you deserve. She carries herself with a dignity that inspires adults who meet her, and she's already shown signs of becoming a fierce advocate for fairness and equality. Her parents have no doubt that she'll grow up to be someone who makes the world better, who stands up for others the way others stood up for her. Phoebe Morrison is living with the consequences of her hatred. She served her time in prison, she lost everything she'd worked for, and she emerged into a world that knew her name and her crime. Whether she's learned anything, whether she's changed, whether she's found genuine remorse and worked to become better, those are questions only she can answer and time will tell. What's certain is that her moment of cruelty cost her dearly, proving that actions have consequences, that racism isn't something you can just get away with, that there are people who will fight back against injustice, and sometimes, those people have the resources and determination to ensure accountability. And somewhere, in a house in Lagos or on another flight somewhere in the world, there's a little girl in a yellow dress with a stuffed giraffe named Spotty who proved something that the world needs to remember. Even the smallest voices can roar the loudest. Even the most vulnerable among us can spark change that ripples far beyond themselves. Even when systems seem stacked against you, when people in positions of authority abuse their power, when hatred seems to be winning, one person standing up and speaking out can shift everything. Chichi Asala, at 7 years old, changed an entire airline's policies, sent a message to an industry, and reminded all of us that dignity, courage, and justice aren't about size or age or position. They're about character. They're about refusing to accept the unacceptable. They're about knowing your worth and demanding that others recognize it too. If this story moved you, if you felt Chichi's pain and cheered for her vindication, if you believe that standing against injustice matters, then share this story. Send it to your friends, post it on your social media, talk about it with your family. Because every time we share stories of courage and accountability, every time we celebrate justice being served, every time we refuse to let racism and cruelty go unchallenged, we make the world a little bit better. We send a message that this behavior won't be tolerated, that victims will be believed and protected, that wrongdoers will face consequences. We create a culture where the next Chichi won't have to endure what she endured, where the next Phoebe will know before acting that hatred has a price. What would you have done in Chichi's seat? Would you have stayed quiet, tried to pretend it didn't happen, internalized the hurt? Or would you have been brave enough to speak up, to tell someone, to demand better? What would you have done if you were Cindy, witnessing a child being mistreated? Would you have intervened, sat beside her, documented what was happening? Or would you have been like Mark, shaking your head in disapproval but ultimately doing nothing? These questions matter because we all face moments in our lives where we have to choose whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to intervene or look away, whether to stand for justice or let injustice continue unchallenged. Let us know in the comments what you would have done, what this story makes you think about, how you'll carry these lessons forward. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories of courage, justice, and the triumph of the human spirit. We tell stories that matter, stories that inspire, stories that remind us that good can prevail over evil, that justice can overcome injustice, that even when the world seems dark, there are always people fighting to bring light. Subscribe now and join a community of people who believe that every person deserves dignity, that hatred should always face consequences, and that speaking up for what's right is always worth it. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and remember, your voice matters. Use it.